All right. Okay, so good afternoon now officially. We've passed the noon mark. We've also passed the end of Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. And that means we are now in Deuteronomy, Devarim, exactly. And this is a lovely addition to the Torah, because in the process of Moses saying goodbye to everybody, he gives us a lovely recap of so much that has gone on already. And as I always say, when you're learning, you read it first, and then you review, and then you review what you reviewed. And that's what Moses is trying to do for us. And one of the things that he's reviewing is our march to the land of Israel and some of the special instructions regarding our coming into the land of Israel, because things are changing. Right? We were stuck out in the wilderness for 40-some years, thanks to the spies and our willingness to accept their bad report on the land of Israel. But now we're moving, and that means we need to know exactly where to go and where not to go. And so that's the part of the recap that we're going to be looking at to start. I'm not going to give anything else away until we dive in. So we're on page 991. This is chapter 2 of the book of Devarim. And we're going to start from verse 8. All right, 991, chapter 2, verse 8. We then moved on. Chapter 2, verse 8. And willing to read?
Okay.
I have to twist your arm, I can see. Yeah.
We then moved on, away from our kinsmen, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir.
Wait, why are we moving away from them? Why are we moving away from the descendants of Esau? Wait, what is the other name for the descendants of Esau? Edom, right? E-D-O-M, however you want to pronounce that in English. So these are the descendants of Esau. Why are we not just trampling through their territory?
Because he was promised to them by Hashem.
Because it's their territory. It's their country. Right? So we are going around Edom because God told us that the land of Seir, the land that was given to Esau, would be theirs and not ours. So even though we could have taken them in a fight, we don't, because we were told not to. So we're moving around. Carry on.
Away from the land of Arabah, away from Elat and Etzion Geber, and we marched on in the direction of the wilderness of Moab. And the Lord said to me, do not harass the Moabites or provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession. I have assigned Av as a possession to the descendants of Lot.
Pause for a moment. And this is coming as an answer to part of what we looked at in our parasha last week, which was talking all about the retaliation against the Midianites. You might have been scratching your head going, wait a minute. But when the Midianite did the stuff against us, the Moabites were right there as well. They were like primary instigators. We even discussed that the Moabites were motivated by fear, whereas the Midianites were motivated by probably greed. So that made a little bit of a difference between why we would retaliate. This is the other main difference of why we didn't retaliate and wipe out the Moabite country and take their land. It's because it wasn't ours to take. Moab was given to the descendants of Lot. Remember, that was from one of his daughters. That's the whole other Lot story. Everybody remembers the pillar of salt. Then there is the epilogue, which we don't usually put into children's books. But out of that epilogue came the nation of Moab. And they got land because God gave it to them as a possession, primarily as a spillover of the blessing that God had given to Abraham. Make sense? Okay.
It's interesting. All those people are no longer here. I don't know where those lands are.
These are all along the east bank of the Jordan River.
Yeah, but I can't. Oh.
If you would like, I believe we have a good. There we are. Yes. The first map in the back.
Oh, there it is.
show you the lands as roughly allocated to these people. And if you look on the next page, they show you a bit more of the southern area. So you can see, for example, Midian that we talked about last week. What's that? Yes. Yeah, if you're ever sitting in the synagogue and you're not quite sure if you want to listen to the sermon, look at the back of the Chumash. There are wonderful essays, great maps, and some very interesting pieces. And if you've never looked at the back of the Eitz Chaim, then you're missing one of its very lovely little treasures. So hopefully those maps in the back can give you a good figure of where we are now aiming as we are walking. All right, so this land, that's Moab, is given to the descendants of Lot, but it has a little more history than that.
It was formerly inhabited by the Anim, a people great and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they are counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Enim. Similarly, Seir was formerly inhabited by the Horites, but the descendants of Esau dispossessed them, wiping them out and settling in their place, just as Israel did in the land they were to possess, which the Lord had given to them.
Okay. So, who used to live there?
Yeah. Horites?
Giants.
Yeah.
Right? There used to be giants there, the Anakim. Is this the first time we've mentioned giants in the Torah?
No, we couldn't. The spies came back and told us about the giants.
The spies said that everybody in the land of Canaan looked like giants, or more appropriately, we looked like grasshoppers next to them,
right.
at least to our own view, and we must have looked like that to them too. We also have had a very famous giant called Og that was killed in battle, and we have talked about perhaps also the Rephaim or Anakim and the Nephilim all the way back in the book of Genesis before the flood. So giants seem to crop up from time to time in the Torah, and we actually are going to take a little look at what do we mean when we say giants. Is this Jolly Green Giant type giant? Is this Jack and the Beanstalk type giant? Why are there these people, and what are they all about? But before we get to that, we just have a little bit more reading I want to do in the parasha.
So we crossed the Wadi Zered. The time that we spent in travel from Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the Wadi Zered was 38 years, until that whole generation of warriors had perished from the camp, as the Lord had sworn concerning them. Indeed, the hand of the Lord struck them to root them out from the camp to the last man.
Okay, so this is, of course, the reference to the 38 years we spent after the spies came back with the bad report. When we say we are waiting for the Anshe HaMelchama, the men of war to die, we're not saying that there was something wrong that they were, in quote, men of war, or that people who were of that age that weren't warriors were not included. Anshe HaMelchama is talking about the age category, the people who were 20 years and older, who would have to pass away before we got. Interesting, as an aside, the Midrashim say that none of the people, however, who were slated to die before we entered the land lived less than 60 years, meaning that they weren't killed prematurely, that waiting in order to come into the land for them to pass wasn't about knocking them off before their time. It was giving them time to expire in the natural course of things and then go into the land with the new generation. And then just one more little paragraph about where we're going. We're now on verse 16.
When all the warriors among the people had died off, the Lord spoke to me, saying, "You are now passing through the territory of Moab, through Ah. You will then be close to the Ammonites. Do not harass them or start a fight with them, for I will not give any part of the land of the Ammonites to you as a possession. I have assigned it as a possession to the descendants of Lot."
Okay, so this is the other offspring of Lot, the other branch of Lot, the Ammonites. Just like Moab, they also have their land.
I thought we were going to pass through Moab.
Well, we have to.
Oh, I thought we were going.
If you look back at the map, now that we've all got our finger put there. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can't do this. Because my maps are always so sketchy. To get into the land of Israel, to cross the Jordan River, we're going to have to go across someone's land. Because we came up, if you flip to the next page, we came up from Sinai, and we came up at this southern tip here where the modern-day city of Eilat is, right? And we're now over on this side, waiting to loop in and come in. And we're going to eventually make our landfall at Jericho, which is right there. So if we're going to come into Jericho, then we've got to be walking through some territory that belongs to someone else. And what Moses is saying here, and what God had told him, is that in doing so, we have to make sure that we do not harass or provoke the people that we are passing through. Some of that provocation is entirely in their own minds, because if they're worried and concerned that there's this large group of people walking, but we had to make sure we didn't exacerbate that situation at all in order to come in and get to where we need to be. It's kind of like trying to take your seat near the window when all the other seats have already been filled on the airplane. It's, excuse me, can I just scoot through and sit over there?
Over 1 million people. Was it 1.2 or 4 million?
Excuse me. just let me slip through.
Real hard to slip through.
And just like on an airplane, right? You never can just like slip in. Or imagine if you're in the middle of a concert or a play and you need to get up and use the facilities, and you're leaving from the middle of the row all the way to the end. It's pardon me, excuse me, pardon me. Yeah, there's no way to do that like you're a ninja. It's going to be disruptive, and God is telling us don't be too disruptive.
Well, the other part of it is if you're the Moabites and you see this huge group of people come, you think it's an army.
Yeah, but we were an army.
And that's what it looks like. You don't know that they have in mind that they're just going to go peacefully. You got to be really scared to see.
Well, we did send emissaries. We did send emissaries to tell them that this is not an invasion, that we are just passing through, and we just need to get over there.
They knew we were telling the truth. Okay.
Well, yeah, because we always believe that our neighbors tell the truth.
Yes.
And that's some of the difficulty.
Yeah. Wow.
So we're going to go ahead and take a break from our reading and look on a little bit more about this giant question. Got someone close enough to pass it to directly on this side. That's good. So we're going to back up to our question about Og, since he is the most famous giant. He gets the most attention by the commentators, and see what we can learn a little bit about him. We have sheets all around? Sheets all around. All right.
Oh, good. And the Lord said to Moses, fear Og not.
All right, so don't be afraid of Og, which of course leads to the question.
Why was it that he feared Og? Well, he did not fear Sihon,
Which was also considered to be one of the giants. And why would God have needed to reassure Og but not had to reassure Moses about Sihon?
So Yochanan, citing Rav Shimon by Yochai, replied, from the answer that was given to the righteous man, you may understand what was in his mind. He thought, perhaps the merit of our father Abraham will stand him by, for it is said, and there came one that escaped and told Avram the Hebrew, in connection with which Rav Yochanan explained, this refers to Og, who escaped the fate of the generation of the flood.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack there.
Oh, yeah.
In the typical rabbinic fashion, the stories are coming in short little bites that needed to be unfolded. All right, so there came one that had escaped and told Avram the Hebrew. What Avram story are we talking about here?
When he fought?
When he fought, exactly, right? When he fought against the kings that had come to attack the Canaanite cities that were along the Jordan Valley. When Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities were attacked by the kings coming from the further east. And when they came and attacked, of course, who was living in Sodom at the time? Lot. And they took Lot captive. And so an escapee came and told Avram about what had happened and told him that Lot had been taken prisoner. And so Avram leapt into action with his 300 guys, and they went off and they rescued Lot. So that's the story that's being described here. The commentator, the Midrash, is saying, who is the one who had escaped. Right? Who's that guy? Because we don't like unnamed people in the Torah. Everybody's got to have an ID badge. And just the one who escaped isn't good enough. So who is the one who escaped? It's Og. And why do we know it would have been Og? Because Og escaped the flood. How did he escape the flood? Because he was a giant. Exactly.
The
Are you?
The water only came to his knees.
Okay, well, we'll get to exactly how big he was in a minute, but that's the. Why are you laughing? So if we want to talk about the guy that escaped, the one that got away.
The flood was a lot taller than the giant.
So how big do you think a giant might be? What would you consider it?
Jewish people, 6'4".
Well, so what is the world's record for height? A little over 8 feet, exactly. And somewhere in the upper 7 feet if you want to get tall but not have major medical conditions. And I highly recommend if you look up some of the pictures of the tallest people in the world. It is quite staggering how tall, like almost 9 feet looks next to a regular person. It's just bizarre. But would that impress you? If I told you that Goliath was 8 foot tall, you'd be impressed?
I'd be impressed with 6 feet tall.
That would make you think that an army couldn't assail them. We can't fight against him. They've got a 7 foot tall person in their army. Well, all of the Anakim were considered giants. But the question of what makes somebody a giant, how many feet before we're impressed? How many feet before 10 foot? 10 foot. We want something a little beyond the realm of nature, right? Not just a good NBA starting center, but somebody that when I look at them, I cannot possibly believe that happened through the normal course of human birth. And it's like, whoa, this is weird. But 10 foot, yeah, that's not surviving the flood so well. Yeah, you got to look up. Well, if I walk into an NBA locker room, I'm going to be looking up. And, what's that?
I said I wouldn't bother her.
You just hurt your neck too much, exactly. So the idea here given in this midrash is, first of all, that Og was big enough to survive the flood without drowning. Secondly, that Og was the one who gave Avram the news that Lot had been captured. And thirdly, that because he came and gave such helpful news, he therefore had a little shield of having done a good deed for Avram. And that would be why Moses would be afraid of Og and not of Sihon, because Og had merit, or Og had some credit to him, a bit of a blessing. It had rubbed off a little bit because he had done something good. Now the Midrash goes on further to say that Og only told Avram this because he was hoping Avram would go off and fight and die. But even still, he did a good deed for Avram. And so that might be why Moses was afraid. What does that then tell us about what is the true measure of a person's worth? Their actions, not their physical height. Right? So even while the Midrash is giving us the idea that Og was tall enough to survive the flood without any support, it is, if you will, cutting him off at the knees and saying, but the true strength that he had, the only thing that would make Moses afraid would be whether this person had any good deeds to their name, good actions. Don't tell me how tall he is, tell me how good he is. And if he's a little good, then I've got to be a little worried. But if he's tall and bad, I'm not afraid at all, which is going to be sort of reinforced in the next section.
Og said, how large is the camp of Israel? 3 parasangs. He went and uprooted a mountain the size of 3 parasangs and carried it on his head. But the Holy One, blessed be he, sent ants, which bored a hole in it so that it sank around his neck. He tried to pull it off, but his teeth projected on each side, and he couldn't pull it off. The height.
All right, but just make sure we got the picture here, right? So he picks up this like mile-wide mountain that he's going to drop on the camp of the Israelites. Ants chew a hole in it, so it slips down over his head. And when he goes to lift it, his tusks are digging into the dirt, and he can't get it off his head. So that's the size that we're talking about here.
Wow.
Wow. Okay. But what happens?
The height of Moses was 10 cubits.
Hold on. Wait. How tall?
10 cubits.
Moses was 10 cubits. How big is 10 cubits?
Well, 15 feet.
About 15 feet. Right? NBA All-Star. Right? So
Oh, yeah.
Moses was 10 cubits. And then what does he do?
He took an axe 10 cubits long, leapt 10 cubits into the air, and struck him on his ankle and killed him.
So 30 cubits up, which is approximately 45 feet, you're hitting Og's ankle, which would make him 800, 900 feet tall.
That's a giant.
That's a giant. Don't give me none of this 10-foot stuff. What's that?
At that height, he could survive flood.
At that height, we're beginning to say, stand on the top of a mountain and you're 800 feet higher than it.
How do we know it was 3 times Moses' height?
Well, we're going off the idea that if Moses is 10 cubits
Yeah.
and his axe is 10 cubits and he jumps 10 cubits, that means he's up 30 feet or 30 cubits off the ground, which is about 45 feet. But he only hits Og in the ankle. So if he has to jump to hit him in the ankle, then how tall must the full giant actually be? And that's where you can do a little bit of math, and you work this out to be about 800, 900 feet tall if we're assuming normal proportions of a human being, rather than Og just had really high ankles and then the rest of him was normal.
But I still think Moses needs some help, because if Og could survive the flood, a little tap on the ankle is going to kill him.
with a tiny little axe in comparison,
Yeah.
which means
More to it.
more to it. Or is this from Brachot? Is this meant to be literal?
Oh.
You would think
I
not.
would think not. No 900 feet.
Children's story.
Do you think the Talmud is full of children's stories? That's in the Talmud. Where's Little Red Riding Hood? Where's the story of the 3 little pigs? Right.
There's one right here.
Well, the question is, when we use the term children's story, we use it often dismissively. That this is a story you just tell to kids, and adults don't bother themselves with stories like that. The sages bothered themselves with these stories. And that means that they definitely felt that there was truth in them. Whether that truth was how to paint a picture of Moses and make sure you get his height right, or whether the truth was something else, is what we're going to have to wrestle with. And then that goes to the same for, was the Talmud really interested in making sure we knew exactly the measurements of Og so that we could pick him out of a lineup? Or is it trying to tell us something else by the reference of his size? And this is sort of the first taste of it. What we're going to get from Devarim Rabbah, one of the other Midrashim collections, a beginning of an answer of why this scale issue might matter as a very important teaching. So, next paragraph.
At that time, I don't know what time.
This is when Moses sees Og. Right, he's
Verse-
getting ready to fight.
Okay, at that time, Moses grew very afraid. The Holy One said, "Do not fear. I will make him fall before you." Og would lift a mountain and throw it at the Jewish people, and Moses would take a pebble, recite the name, Hashem, and deflect it.
Okay, so here we have a slightly different version of the Midrash than we did in the Talmud, which is that he actually got to throw the mountain rather than it falling around his head. But when he throws the mountain, how does Moses stop it?
With a pebble?
With a pebble.
King David.
But why just a little pebble? That just
He
what's
just had to deflect it. He didn't have to stop it. He just had to make it go.
Somewhere
Oh,
else.
somewhere.
so? Is it Moses's physical strength that hurls the pebble so hard that it can deflect a giant mountain?
No, it's God's name written on
Well, it's not
Recited,
necessarily
not
written,
written.
recited, not necessarily inscribed, but it's the idea that it is Moses' understanding and connection to God that gives him the strength to defeat that which seems undefeatable with something that would seem to be inconsequential. Right? It is the ultimate example of the small defeating the mighty, because the small ain't small when you measure it right. It may look small. It looks just like a pebble. But a pebble combined with God's name, combined with an understanding and connection to God, is better than a giant throwing a mountain. And that is what Maharal from the 1500s comes to try and explain for us. If you would read the next paragraph.
Every person has two aspects. One, his physical form, which is common to the entire species. But every person also has a personal inner metaphysical form. Sometimes the sages said that so-and-so was such and such a height, and they attributed huge dimensions to him.
Sounds familiar.
But this too is from the perspective of his inner form, even though it cannot be actualized in the physical world because of the general form of human beings, since every person is created within the framework of the laws of nature, and these dictate that a person cannot be so small or so big.
All right, so Maharal is saying, if the world was a true reflection of the spirit of a person, then Moses would have been a giant. But Moses was human, and humans, although they have this amazing inner capacity, are limited by the laws of nature. They're limited that they have to fit within the boundaries of the species. So a human being, even one that is so great, is still going to be limited by what it means to be a human being. And that means they're going to cap out their height somewhere south of 9 foot. But that doesn't mean that we should think, therefore, that what the sages were talking about wasn't true. Because what the sages were trying to describe for us was the spiritual essence of the person. And that's really, I think, very nicely reflected by the Devarim Rabbah quote, with the idea that a pebble combined with God's name is more than sufficient to tackle a mountain, right? The inner strength of Moses was much, much bigger than the external strength of Og. And when we are trying to imagine for ourselves and plan for ourselves what strength we want to work on, which of the two is better? And if you have to choose between going to the gym and building up your muscles so that you can be the bodybuilder extraordinaire, or studying so that you can be the spiritual person extraordinaire, which way do you think our tradition suggests you spend your time? Really, this isn't meant to be a trick question.
No, I thought it was rhetorical.
Okay, well, okay. So I just wanted to make sure we all got that. Now, of course, as a little aside footnote, obviously Judaism does believe that exercise or good physical activity for the sake of the body's health and good working is perfectly fine. It's the excessive focus that goes well beyond what it means to just be healthy or to have an enjoyable life that is unfortunately unbalanced for some of us. And what Maharal is trying to do is bring us into line, and also to help us read the words of the sages without chuckling, without guffawing, without saying it's a kid's story or it's a fairy tale, and moving on as though there was nothing left to learn. But instead to read them and say, oh, you know what? It may sound a little silly to imagine Og was, 800 foot tall. But if we understand that that's being used as his physical strength versus Moses' spiritual strength, now I can see what they're trying to teach me. All right, and just to drive this home, Moreh Nevochim, this is from Rambam.
And in Amos it says, whose height is like that of cedar trees. Instances of this kind are frequent in the language of all prophets. What they say is frequently hyperbolic or exaggerated and not precise or exact.
All right, so pause right there. Make sure you understand what Rambam is saying here in Guide for the Perplexed. All right, when Amos says that their heights are like the height of cedar trees, does he mean someone is as tall as a cedar and you could go out with a tape measure and it would measure the same height for the two things? No, it does not mean that literally. Rambam is saying you do not read every reference in the Tanakh, let alone within the sages, as being a literal description of the object that they are describing. Instead, it is often meant as hyperbole, exaggeration, or a thereabout reading. By the way, that's one of the very important ways of understanding why when the measurement for the pillars at the Temple of Solomon seem to indicate that pi is 3 rather than 3.1415 it's because it wasn't trying to give you the decimal points. It was just trying to give you the round figure. It wasn't meaning to be exact in the way that a geometrist would be exact. However, when it comes to Og, Moses is actually going to say that the Torah is literally true here.
what the scripture says about Og. Behold, his bedstead was an iron bedstead, 9 cubits its length.
Right, wait, 9 cubits. So 9 cubits would be approximately almost 15 feet. He thinks Og was 15 feet tall? Keep reading.
This does not belong to this class of figures, for the bedstead is never exactly of the same dimensions as the person using it. It is not like a dress that fits around the body. It is always greater than the sleeper. As a rule, it is by a third longer.
All right, so Rambam in his typical fashion says, I know it said his bed was 9 cubits long, but are you as long as your bed? Usually not. Usually our bed is longer than our body. That's intentional, right? It's not like my shirt, which is supposed to fit me and be relatively accurate to my shape. My bed has to have a little buffer, and so too with Og. So then he's going to do the math for us.
If therefore the bed of Og was 9 cubits in length, he must, according to this proportion, have been 6 cubits high, or a little more. Scripture thus tells us that Og was double as long as an ordinary person, or a little less. This is undoubtedly an exceptional height among men, but not quite impossible.
Which is right. By Rambam's estimate, and also depending upon how you measure a cubit, that comes out to be about the upper limit of human height. And so it is conceivable that Og would have been about 8 foot tall or 8.5 feet tall. And that would have been pretty huge and very, very impressive, but not outside the realm of just the natural working of things.
An average man would be about 4.5.
Well, back in the days of Rambam, not so unlikely. I know many people that are 5 foot or just under 5 foot, and that's with the modern world and modern nutrition and all the things that we have that help people grow higher than they ever did in the past. So to live 1,000 years ago in the days of Rambam, to imagine that somebody would be 4.5 or thereabouts, yeah, that's perfectly reasonable that would have been the normal height. And then you can imagine somebody who was 8 or so feet tall would have been, it would have been like us seeing a 10-foot person. All right. And Rambam goes on to make this point more broadly.
Our efforts and the efforts of select individuals are in contrast to the efforts of the masses. For with the masses, who are people of the Torah, that which is beloved to them and tasty to their folly is that they should place Torah and rational thinking as 2 opposite extremes, and will derive everything impossible as distinct from that which is reasonable, and they say it's a miracle, and they flee from something being in accordance with natural law, whether something recounted from past events, with something that's in the present, or with something that's said to happen in the future.
All right, pause there. Long sentence, I know. I didn't want to interrupt Rambam. So he's saying, for people that are engaged in real study, we have no problem seeing that both Torah and rational thinking go together. But for the masses, according to Rambam, they love their fairy tales. They love those stories. They love the idea that Og really was 800 foot tall, and that image of Moses, who was 15 foot tall, leaping up with a 15-foot axe, 15 feet into the air and hitting that ankle. That just makes the best image ever. And if you try to tell them that it's a metaphor, that it's an analogy, that it is a hyperbole, they'll be angry. They want to hold on to that. Because if you say, but it doesn't fit with rational thought, they'll say, good. Reasonable. I'm proud that I believe something to be miraculous because it isn't reasonable. That just makes me stronger and more faithful and happier in all my ways. And note that what he's talking about here is that when you try to talk to people about these sorts of images and ideas, whether it be about something that has been from the past, something that is in their own present day, or something that they believe for the future, like when reading through the words of the prophets, if you try to help them see how the words of the prophets or the words of our texts, or even just the words of people around them, fit with reasonable, rational explanations, they will reject it. And he's just sort of going, so frustrating, so frustrating. So he goes on.
But we shall endeavor to integrate the Torah with rational thought, leading events according to the natural order wherever possible, only with something that is clarified to be a miracle and cannot otherwise be explained at all will we say that it's a miracle?
Right? We don't throw around the title miracle as a real description for an event unless there is no other explanation. We don't deny that it's possible that it was a miracle, but we don't start there. We end up there. So if someone says, my cat, was gone and came back, a year later, it's a miracle. It might be, or it might be a cat, and cats can sometimes do that sort of thing. That doesn't mean that it was a supernatural act that teleported your cat back to you, or that somehow preserved the cat. It's not uncommon for cats to be of such dispositions. That's partly what makes cats cats. So throwing around the term miracle as a real descriptor, not as just I feel like it was a miracle, or it seems like a miracle, or I'm as happy as though it were a miracle, or I'm going to just use the term miracle to mean I think God has helped me in this way, but I'm not claiming that the laws of nature were totally broken and bent, but just that I feel God's help. Fine, use the word miracle as a casual term all you want, but if you want to describe it technically, then you have to be really sure you've ruled out every other possibility. And then this matters halachically in Jewish law, because when a miracle is done for us, we have an obligation to recite a blessing when we see the place where that miracle happened. So you better make sure that it's a real bona fide miracle before you go around throwing blessings, because doing a bracha levatala, doing a wasted blessing, is a definite transgression. So you can't just say, I'm going to say the blessing like that time that I came up to the traffic light and it went green, and so that's a miracle. You don't just say a blessing every time you get back to that intersection, because that would be a transgression rather than honoring God's name. Make sense? Oh, you didn't know we had blessings for personal miracles?
I didn't know that you had to say it every time you went to that place,
Mm-hmm.
and that it would be a transgression if you did when it wasn't a real miracle.
In general, any blessing that you say when it is not the appropriate moment, apart from teaching and learning, is considered to be a transgression. That's why, like before we eat, we think about what we're about to eat so that we make sure we say the right blessing rather than say a wrong blessing and have transgressed. It's why, as a form of compromise, when we say the second blessing for the tefillin shel rosh, for the head tefillin, we say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed right afterwards, because there's a controversy of whether that second blessing is truly needed or not. And by saying that second line, we are saying, if it wasn't needed, then consider what I just said merely to be an abstract praise of God, and rather than a wasted blessing. So we're covering our bases.
So we need something like that to say if we bless the signal light.
We could, except for the tefillin, there is a legitimate reason to think why it should be a separate blessing, and a legitimate reason to think why it shouldn't be a separate blessing. With the intersection miracle, where the light went green faster than usual, you would really have to be very sure there was a legitimate reason to think that God had broken the laws of nature for your benefit at that moment, before you could say, I'll say the blessing and do the Baruch Shem Kavod, which I think would be hard to establish.
If you were driving on the way to the hospital with someone who was greatly ill in the back of the car,
and all the lights were green.
all
Right.
lights were green.
Absolutely. Or if you get through an intersection and right behind you a tree falls, and if you've been there a second earlier or a second later, you would have been hit. Absolutely, you can consider that as a potential miracle. Again, you'd have to examine and reflect, but at least it's in the realm of possibility. But for trivial things that are easily explained by just the way of the world, we can thank God that his world benefited us, but we shouldn't be quick to throw out the label miracle and mean it legitimately. Again, casual use of the term miracle. I was standing in line at the bank and it was a miracle. It only took me 5 minutes. Fine, use it as an idiom, no problem. But if you want to claim it as a real miracle, as proof of God breaking the laws of nature on your behalf, the standard is a little higher.
But it doesn't have to actually be breaking the laws of nature. It's if something happens within the laws of nature at the right time, in the right place, to save you or your family or something like that.
Correct.
That
Correct.
could be
If the serendipity stretches credulity to such an extent, or it is so fortuitous because of the saving of your family, then yes, the term miracle can apply, even if it appears to have been done completely with natural causes, but that the timing was just too perfect, then that becomes the element of miracle, when it's beyond the scope of what is normal.
But we have a blessing for time. You know, this moment.
The Shehechianu, yes. But that's the blessing for now, not the blessing for yesterday.
Okay.
When we say the Shechianu, we're saying this moment right now is special.
Instant.
And I thank God that I'm able to be here right now.
This moment.
Okay, we still got a bit more to go, because now that we sort of understand that these giants probably weren't literal Jack and the Beanstalk giants, we still want to talk a little bit more about the land that they're in, because it seems a little confusing of who's living where. So that's where we're picking up with Rashi on the second page.
You might think that this is the land of the Rephaim, which I gave to Abraham in Genesis, because the Emim, who are Rephaim, dwelt there formerly. But this is not that land.
Okay, so way back in Genesis 15, God says that he's going to give the land of the Rephaim to Abraham, and the Emim, which is another name that crops up for these people in a few more verses, is a synonym for Rephaim. It's another term for a giant, just like Rephaim is another term for giant. And so you might think, well, wait a minute, if God already gave this land to Abraham, then why do we have to let Esau or Moab or Ammon or anyone else live here? Right? If this was already given to Abraham, it should be ours, and I don't care who's living here. And he goes on to explain,
But it's not that land, because those Rephaim I drove out from before the children of Lot and settled these in their stead.
right? So what he's saying is that no, because those people I got rid of, and now Lot has the land, and therefore it is his. So it was given to Abraham, and by Abraham it was then given, or through extension, it was then given to Lot. So I have fulfilled my promise to Abraham by giving it to Lot, and that means you don't get it. You don't get to come and take it away from them. If it had only been the Rephaim still living here, then yes, you would be able to drive out the Rephaim and take them. But I've already done that, and it's already gone to a relative of Abraham. Therefore, hands off. Make sense? Okay, onward.
They were considered as Anakim, as giants, not because of their height, but because of their physical strength. That they were not truly giants is clear from the fact that the Moabites call them Emim.
They don't actually call them Anakim. We're going to come back to Emim in just a minute, of what that word itself means. But so the Chizkuni is trying to say, we weren't actually ever thinking of them as being literal giants of enormous stature. We just meant they inspire fear. They are so strong as giants. I'm jumping ahead here. And someone, if I said he's as strong as a giant, you'd all know what I meant. And none of you would imagine somebody 10 foot tall standing behind me. Right? Maybe? Okay. Rabbeinu Bachya has a slightly different take, but very similar.
The reason that these Rephaim were considered as identical with the Emim, fear-inspiring,
Which is
giants,
exactly fear-inspiring like giants, is the Emim. They're drashing the word to mean something that inspires fear.
was that although they themselves were not giants, they nonetheless succeeded in making everyone afraid of them as if they had been giants.
Okay, which, to come full circle back around, what was the main reason why we are taking this long route into Israel in the first place? Why didn't we take the direct route once we were at Mount Sinai and we came up to the border and in the Negev and we sent the spies in?
Because of the giants there.
Because of the giants. Okay, and what does it mean for someone to be a giant? To instill fear. And what was the exact feeling that the Israelite spies came back with? They were afraid. They were insecure. They said they look strong. They make me feel afraid. How could I possibly fight them? I'm like a grasshopper next to them. And that's exactly what the characteristic of being a, quote, giant is it inspires that sort of fear, and but that's more a sense of lacking of self-confidence. And how did we then gain the confidence to come into the lands that used to be, in quote, inhabited by giants? We spent 38 years or more, right, out in the desert, connecting with God, understanding Torah, growing ourselves spiritually, throwing rocks while calling on God's name. And once we did that, once we truly understood God's name, once we understood Torah, the giants didn't look like giants anymore. They just looked like people. And that wasn't because they had gotten shorter, it's because we had gotten taller. In Maharal's other aspect, our internal strength had grown, and their physical strength didn't scare us anymore.
In addition, it was a whole new generation who hadn't had overseers beating them or any of that.
Absolutely.
And they were the ones who were not afraid. The other generation had...
For many of that first generation, the older part of that generation, they were never going to be able to have that sense of strong self that would see their enemies as something that wasn't so terrifying. For them, they were used to living in terror, and that meant that anyone with a spear looked like a giant to them. And we had to overcome that. But we didn't overcome it by just drilling and buffing ourselves up. We overcame it by having the Torah and using it for those 38 years. All right, little digression, just because I love this little piece. And I didn't want to finish without bringing these two quotes from Sforno. But in order to understand what Sforno's talking about, we're going to have to go back into our Torah text. I wasn't sure if we would get here, so I left this to the end. So we're on page 993 again. And we're going to be looking at verse 20 through the bottom of the place, the bottom of the page.
It, too, is counted as Rephaim country. It was formerly inhabited by the Rephaim, whom the Ammonites called Zamzummim, a people great and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. The Lord wiped them out, so that the Ammonites dispossessed them and settled in their place. He did for the descendants of Esau who lived in Seir, when he wiped out the Horites before them, so that they dispossessed them and settled in their place, as is still the case. So too with the Avim, who dwelt in villages in the vicinity of Gaza, the Kaftorim, who came from Crete, wiped them out and settled in their place.
All right, so this is a bit of a reconciliation of why some of the names of the people living in some places that is being discussed here, and then later in the book of Joshua, isn't exactly identical with the name of the people mentioned, names of the people mentioned in Genesis when Abraham is coming into the land in the first place. And he's explaining, people have moved. There have been invasions, counter-invasions, and a shuffling of who lives where. And so in order to understand what we get and what we don't get, we have to make sure we can tally who the people are in the day that we are walking in and what land they actually occupy. And so therefore, we're going to come back to Sforno in his first commentary there, second paragraph from the bottom.
Even though the land belonged to the descendants of Esau, or the Philistines, with whom Abraham had made a solemn non-aggression pact, the Israelites were not now denied the right to conquer these lands.
Right, so this area down here next to Gaza and the southern coastal plain of what we would call the state of Israel today should be either considered part of Esau, part of Seir, or part of the Philistine area, which Abraham had made with Avimelech a deal that his land would stay his and Abraham would keep his own land as well, right? They made that pact, which we famously read on Rosh Hashanah. So why then are we being given permission to conquer the land? Well, because
the Philistines no longer owned the land in question. The Cretans had emigrated from Crete because their island...
Cretans? Who are the Cretans?
Yeah, that's right.
The Kaftorim.
Oh.
Right? The people from Kaftor were considered by many scholars to be the Cretans. These were Cretes that left the Isle of Crete. And Sforno is going to give a particular reason why they left, but there's lots of different historical options.
They left because their island could not contain them all. And the Philistines had annihilated the Avim and replaced them in that land.
Actually, the Cretans had annihilated.
Oh, Cretans had?
Right. So the Philistines had left because they were driven out by Cretans who had also destroyed the Avim. So even though it's the land of the Avim and it's the land of the Philistines, it's actually Kaftorim, Cretans, who are living there at the moment, and therefore we don't owe them anything. So we can therefore,
So when the Israelites conquered the land in which Abimelech used to be king, it already had been lost.
exactly, right? So we didn't break the treaty with Avimelech. We didn't take any land that belonged to Esau. We took land that had formerly belonged to Avimelech, but which he and his people had already lost to this other wave of invaders, and we had no deal with them, and therefore we were able to take that part of the land. Geopolitics in 3,000 plus years ago. Yeah, the story doesn't really change all that much, does it?
No.
Yeah.
Right? So who owns Poland, right?
Yes, right.
Well, and Alsace-Lorraine, the
Right.
Germans took it from the French took it back, and then the Italians. This has been going on for a while, but God is very concerned that we honor our agreements with those with whom we have agreements, and that we protect ourselves from any of the enemies that are around, and that we secure the borders of Israel correctly. Because there is a way of doing it too much, which is what Sforno brings in the next passage.
Esau and Moab destroyed more land and people than they needed for themselves. They did so in order to wipe out all the former people residing there so that those people could not one day avenge their defeat. This was a totally unjustifiable genocide. Neither Esau nor Moab populated all the land under their control.
Right? They wiped out these people because they didn't like them, not because they planned to settle in that whole region. And a war for our people need land and your people aren't using it is considered reasonable under most of history. It's not something that we do so much anymore, thank God. But in the ancient history, our people need room, and otherwise we're going to starve because we need more farmland, because that was the only way to get food, really. That was an acceptable reason to go to war. But I'm then going to take more land from you and kill more of your people than I need just because I'm afraid you might eventually seek revenge against me. That's unacceptable, which Sforno, who lived long before the Holocaust came along, is already calling as an unacceptable wiping out of another nation, what we would call genocide now. And that is not appropriate. Which is why, even though at later times when the Israelites are in ascendancy, they do not wipe out the neighboring countries that attack them. We have wars with them, right? The Amorites attack us, the Assyrians attack us, and there are times when we are stronger than they are and we fight against them. But when we fight against them, we do not wipe them out, every last person. There are some times when we do for the Canaanites, yes, and that's a special case which we've talked about in past classes. But in general, when we're only expanding or trying to secure enough for our people to eat, we take great pains not to kill more than is necessary in order to protect our own country. And Esau and Moab are both being criticized for having done much more than was necessary for themselves. And when they did so, they transgressed. So knowing where your borders are and knowing what you should and shouldn't do is a very important thing. Which is why the Torah is spending so much time on it in this week's parasha, and why, of course, in the book of Joshua, we get a lot more details as well. It's not just take everything you can. It's take what God has given you, leave for those others what God has given them. It's a good rule of thumb. All right, take care, and see you again.